A curious thing about the ontological problem is its simplicity. It can be put in 3 Anglo-Saxon monosyllables. What is there? It can be answered, moreover, in a word. Everything. And everyone will accept this answer as true. However, this is merely to say that there is what there is. There remains room for disagreement over causes, and so the issue has stayed alive down the centuries. Now suppose that 2 philosophers, McX and I, differ over ontology. Suppose McX maintains that there is something which I maintain there is not. McX can, quite consistently with his own point of view, describe our difference of opinion by saying that I refuse to recognize certain entities. I should protest, of course, that he is wrong in his formulation of our disagreement, for I maintain that there are no entities of the kind which he alleges for me to recognize. But my finding him wrong in his formulation of our disagreement is unimportant, for I am committed to considering him in his ontology anyway. When I try to formulate our difference of opinion, on the other hand, I seem to be in a predicament. I cannot admit that there are some things which McX countenances and I do not, for in admitting that there are such things, I should be contradicting my own rejection of them. It would appear, if this reasoning were sound, that in any ontological dispute, the proponent of the negative side suffers the disadvantage of not being able to admit that his opponent disagrees with him. This is the old Platonic riddle of non-being. Non-being must in some sense be. Otherwise, what is it that there is not? This tangled doctrine that we nicknamed Plato's beard, historically it has been proved tough, frequently dueling the edge of Occam's razor. It is some such line of thought that leads philosophers like McX to impute being, where they might otherwise be quite content to recognize that there is nothing. Thus, take Pegasus. If Pegasus were not, McX argues, we should not be talking about anything when we use the word. Therefore, it would not be nonsense to say that even Pegasus is not. Thinking to show, thus, that the denial of Pegasus cannot be coherently maintained, he concludes Pegasus is. McX cannot, indeed, quite persuade himself that any region of space-time, near or remote, contains a flying horse of flesh and blood. Pressed for further details on Pegasus, then, he says that Pegasus is an idea in men's minds. Here, however, a confusion begins to be apparent. We may, for the sake of argument, concede that there is an entity, and even a unique entity, though this is rather implausible, which is the mental Pegasus idea. But this mental entity is not what people are talking about when they deny Pegasus. McX never confuses the Parthenon with the Parthenon idea. The Parthenon is physical, the Parthenon idea is mental, according anyway to McX's version of ideas, and I have no better to offer. The Parthenon is visible, the Parthenon is invisible. We cannot easily imagine 2 things more unalike and less liable to confusion than the Parthenon and the Parthenon idea. But when we shift from the Parthenon to Pegasus, the confusion sets in, for no other reason than McX would sooner be deceived by the crudest and most flagrant counterfeit than grant the known being of Pegasus. The notion that Pegasus must be, because otherwise it would be nonsense to say that even Pegasus is not, has been seen to lead McX into elementary confusion. Subtler minds, taking the same precept as their starting point, come out with theories of Pegasus which are less patently misguided than McX's, and corresponding more difficult to eradicate. One of these subtler minds is named, let us say, Wyman. Pegasus, Wyman maintains, has his being as an unactualized possible. When we say of Pegasus that there is no such thing, we are saying, more precisely, that Pegasus does not have the special attribute of actuality. Saying that Pegasus is not actual is on par, logically, with saying that the Parthenon is not red. In either case, we are saying that something about an entity whose being is unquestioned. Wyman, by the way, is one of the philosophers who have united in ruining the good old word exist. Despite his espousal of unactualized possibles, he limits the word existence to actuality, thus preserving an illusion of ontological agreement between himself and us who repudiate the rest of his bloated universe. We have all been prone to say in our common-sense usage of exist that Pegasus does not exist, meaning simply that there is no such entity at all. If Pegasus existed, he would indeed be in space and time, but only the word Pegasus has spatio-temporal connotations, and not because it exists has spatio-temporal connotations. A spatio-temporal reference is lacking when we affirm the existence of the cube root of 27. This is simply because a cube root is not a spatio-temporal kind of thing, and not because we are ambiguous in our use of exist. However, Wyman, in an ill-conceived effort to appear agreeable, genially grants us the non-existence of Pegasus, and then, contrary to what we meant by non-existence of Pegasus, insists that Pegasus is. Existence is one thing, he says, and subsistence is another. The only way I know of copying this obfuscation of issues is to give Wyman the word exist. I'll try not to use it again. I still have is. So much for lexicography. Let's get back to Wyman's ontology. Wyman's overpopulated universe is in many ways unlovely. It offends the aesthetic sense of us to have a taste for desert landscapes. But this is not the worst of it. Wyman's slum of possibles is a breeding ground for disorderly elements. Take, for instance, the possible fat man in that doorway, and again, the possible bald man in that doorway. Are they the same possible man or two possible men? How do we decide? How many possible men are there in that doorway? Are there more possible thin ones than fat ones? How many of them are alike? Or would their being alike make them one? Are no two possible things alike? Is this the same thing as saying that it is impossible for two things to be alike? Or, finally, is the concept of identity simply inapplicable to unactualized possibles? But what sense can be found in talking of entities which cannot meaningfully be said to be identical with themselves and distinct from one another? These elements are well nigh incorrigible. By a Phrygian therapy of individual concepts, some effort might be made at rehabilitation, but I feel we'd do better simply to clear Wyman's slum and be done with it. Possibility, along with other modalities of necessity and impossibility and contingency, raises problems upon which I do not mean to imply that we should not turn our backs. But we can at least limit modalities to whole statements. We may impose the adverb possibly upon a statement as a whole, and we may as well worry about the semantical analysis of such usage. But little real advance in such analysis is to be hoped for in expanding our universe to include so-called possible entities. I suspect that the main motive for this expansion is simply the old notion that Pegasus, for example, must be, because otherwise it would be nonsense to even say that he is not. Still, the rank luxuriance of Wyman's universe of possibles would seem to come to naught when we make a slight change in the example, and speak not of Pegasus, but of the round square cupola on Berkeley College. If, unless Pegasus were, it would be nonsense to say that he is not, then by the same token, unless the round square cupola on Berkeley College were, it would be nonsense to say that it is not. But, unlike Pegasus, the round square cupola on Berkeley College cannot be admitted even as an unactualized possible. Can we drive Wyman now to admitting also a realm of unactualizable possibles? If so, a good many embarrassing questions could be asked about them. We might hope even to trap Wyman in contradictions by getting him to admit that certain of these entities are at once round and square. But the wily Wyman chooses the other horn of this dilemma and concedes that it is nonsense to say that the round square cupola on Berkeley College is not. He says that the phrase round square cupola is meaningless. Wyman was not the first to embrace this alternative. The doctrine of the meaninglessness of contradictions runs way back. The tradition survives, moreover, in writers who seem to share none of Wyman's motivations. Still, I wonder whether the first temptation to such a doctrine may not have been substantially the motivation which we have observed in Wyman. Certainly the doctrine has no intrinsic appeal, but it has led its devotees to such quixotic extremes, that of challenging the proof by reductio ad absurdum, a challenge in which I sense a reductio ad absurdum of the doctrine itself. Moreover, the doctrine of meaninglessness of contradictions has the severe methodological drawback that it makes it impossible in principle ever to devise an effective test of what is meaningful and what is not. It would be forever impossible for us to devise systematic ways of deciding whether a string of signs makes sense, even to us individually, let alone other people or not, for it follows from a discovery in mathematical logic due to the Church, and there can be no generally applicable test of contradictoriness. I have spoken disparagingly of Plato's beard, and hinted that it is tangled. I have dwelt at length on the inconveniences of putting up with it. It is time to think about taking steps.